Bühlmann. I have a talk in our Modul. I'm sure you know Vera Bühlmann, the professor of Materialist. I hope you had the pleasure to have some talks with her already and maybe some exercises. Today I'm happy to welcome her in our special series within the Modul, the Perspectives, where we talk about the challenges that we all face. And we have invited some special guests that we think can contribute to a discussion on future challenges for architects on a wider, broader societal, political, and technological basis for discussion. So again, I know it was a long day today, but I'm happy because we already had some great discussions. So I'm sure we can have some great discussions today too. So please listen to Vera Bühlmann, and if you have any questions,
happy to.
Is also fine,
yes,
I guess.
absolutely.
The most important is that we all learn a lot. Thank you for coming.
Thanks a lot. For this invitation again. I'm always excited. Your courses with the broad spectrum of interests and the refusal a bit of the expert's narrowness. I embrace that a lot, and I'm very happy to speak here. So the topic will be about something that for me also is quite recent to realize, this tradition of natural philosophy and what it meant before Enlightenment and what it could perhaps help us and mean today. It's in relation to this dichotomy that we are usually accustomed to between art on the one hand and science or technology on the other hand, as if they kind of formed two halves of a whole. And what a lot of also the project I want to talk about kind of show or demonstrate, if one wants to see it. So none of the things that I want to suggest are like binding. So one can always look at it differently. Yeah? So that's part of this relation of the natural philosophy that I find very, very beautiful and I think helpful today. So it's not arbitrary and it's not without connection, I hope. I hope you will see some of them as well. But it's not like this is the theory that should become authoritative or anything like that. Indeed, natural philosophy, I will start a little bit with this tradition, maybe had exactly this mark of characteristic, that it would not try to play science versus philosophy or theology versus science, no, in the modern times, or then art versus kind of a positivist understanding of science. It was very much in tune with an idea that also the intellect and thinking itself is natural. So why should we study the fact that we can understand things in a different register than the things which we learn to understand? Yeah? And you will see how this creates a very specific link to mechanics, to the tradition of mechanics. And the tradition of mechanics used to be very different from what we today relate to it. No? Today we have the idea when there's a mechanism, things function just on their own, always in the same way, always constraining, so not opening up, but narrowing down, making things necessary. And to a certain extent, this is, of course, exactly true. But in another extent, it is not, because mechanics is not a closed system which is fully grasped at any one point. No? Every paradigm that keeps to be introduced into thinking will produce a new set of mechanics, a new set of instruments of objectively represent, of mathematically describe relations. And this is why, or I imagine it's why, the term itself, originally etymologically, comes from thinking resourcefulness. No? So thinking that is resourcefulness. So it's a thinking that employs cunning, that employs inventiveness, that employs a conscious relation to coding things. So it makes models, and these models are suggested to convey a certain skill, a certain knowledge, a certain power, no? To convey them, but none of these models would claim to compete with another one for being the only true one. Rather, mechanics in the sense of resourcefulness gives us instruments whose scope and potential depends very much on how they are being instrumented. So it's a kind of a co-articulation between nature and intellect, if you want. So there is objectivity, there is subjectivity. And what started to interest me a lot then is this relation of imagination in the natural philosophy tradition, because it's a sense of imagination, so this capacity to picture things, to take things into sight, and to contemplate what we imagine. No, it's not just having an idea in the sense of a fantasy that arises and we might like it or we might not like it and it goes away. To imagine is something that we do quite considerately. So we can learn to imagine, we can learn to concentrate, we can learn to pay attention to things. That's basically what we do when we learn to decipher a diagram, for example, or also I would say when we learn to read and write text. So imagination was, in that sense as well, a key term not only in mechanics but also in rhetorics. And it's actually what links rhetorics and mechanics. So you might know rhetorics is a kind of a skill or an art of speaking with convincing power. No? So learning to convince somebody, well, I mean, überreden oder überzeugen. No? There's a distinction, of course, which is the problematic side of it. But the point is there is a certain mechanics of how to make an argument well-crafted, in the sense of the reception of what one wants to put in an argument will be maximized in its effectivity. So in touching, in involving people, in convincing, or also betraying people, in polarizing them. So it's a mechanics. A mechanics always has, in a non-moral sense, a positive and a negative pole. No? And invention is a key term in what rhetorics was teaching. That's quite a different register than what we today often like to call creativity. No? So creativity today, we relate it to a kind of a resourcefulness that comes from our inner selves, that is individual and that is absolute in us. Imagination is not like that. Imagination is so it can be conveyed, it can be taught, it is not really our own, but it involves us also in a personal sense. So this is the interesting side of it. And what how I want to structure this talk today is to basically start with giving you a few references and also core formulations of what was meant with system in a natural philosophy sense, and then make a suggestion of how to address this imagination, not as a faculty of thinking. This was the Enlightenment way of addressing it. No, we had in Enlightenment the guiding idea of what knowledge is and how we can account for knowledge being knowledge was that it would conform to the way that our minds were working. And the model that they had of our minds was that every person, every human being who thinks in a similar way, because we all have three faculties that play together. One is memory, one is imagination, and one is reason. So this is the model also that lies behind the notion of the universities as we still largely have them, where you have faculties, so the different faculties that play together. Today, especially with digital technology, with AI specifically now, but one could make the argument much larger for all communication technology, for all media technology, this kind of schema of faculty thinking is either getting into this competition that we hear a lot about. No, AI will beat the human intelligence or the natural intelligence. So this is a way of thinking about these things where there is a kind of a topping and a conquest, basically, that would come from non-humans or some kind of, I mean, there are many narratives around. I'm sure you are familiar with some of them. I don't want to focus on them. I rather want to think of a different way of addressing an imagination in such a natural philosophy sense. And this would be less a faculty that would be organically organizing heads, but it would be through the link to mechanics and mathematics and geometry, much more as a kind of a projection plane. But as a projection plane, this was basically how we used to think of it as the imagination. It's like when we allegorically speak of start to think, but then you have the white sheet of paper and there is this paralyzation of how do we get started. So this is very much thinking of the imagination as a plane. And what I want to suggest with a specific approach to mechanics and to coding and to AI as well is to think of imagination as a screen. As a screen that is a display which partly is natural and partly needs to be instrumented, let's say. It doesn't really matter. It's not not necessarily human specific in this sense. And to my own surprise a bit, there is this one project that helped me to crystallize these ideas in the last year. It is a project by an architect, by Fritz Haller, who was with his students in Karlsruhe, he was conceiving a project for, he called it habitation in near-Earth space, im erdnahen Weltraum. And this is very interesting, because it's not quite the universe, it's not quite the cosmos, it's not quite the Earth. What would it mean, or what did he see in the possibility of creating a place that is not quite transcendent, not quite transcendental, not quite part of it, and actually doesn't exist before it's fabricated? This will be one of the main points. So let's first look a bit at what this looks like. So the first mark of distinction for natural philosophy is that, yes, it has an approach to a system, but the system is not a deductive or an inductive overall order. So the system is more like the zodiac belt, actually. So constellations of things that are interrelated, but that rotate. And one can focus on them by foregrounding certain aspects, and then the whole constellation changes. One can turn it, one can foreground another aspect, and again the whole constellation changes. And it cannot be understood by asking the historical question, what is at the origin and what will be at its telos, at its aim. It's a kind of a contemplation of constellations in a systematic manner. And these constellations, here, for example, was a famous school book, actually, and you see at schools and academies. So across still the kind of science and art divide from the 19th century. And it mainly focuses on different branches of mechanics at that time. What is interesting when you look at this will be difficult to find, the table of content. It's a very bad scan from Google Books. Preface, well, okay, this is fair enough. The first chapter, which will say, okay, what is it then that makes us say all these different branches of mechanics, they form a system? And what natural philosophy would say is, well, all of these mechanics, they apply to bodies. So the notion of what is a body is constitutive for everything. And the notion of what is a body is not a biological question in this sense. It's a metaphysical question. So fire, water, earth, and air would be called bodies, just like in chemistry until the periodic table, which means basically until Mendeleev and electricity. One was speaking of bodies, chemical bodies in such a sense. A chemical body or bodies in this notion was the old sense that the idea with the elements, it's most easy to grasp. the idea was that everything that exists that has a manifestation is made of a mixture of water, fire, earth, and air. So those four would be bodies, but they would never be individualized or appear single. There would never be something like fire without all the others. Every fire which burns involves all the four elements. And the same for earth, the same for everything. So the idea was that it's a notion of bodies which is distributed, it's mixed, and it's universal. So this is the assumption. And it's what the book starts with. So it tries to describe the properties of bodies, and then you see this is the gesture, which is like in metaphysics. So it starts to make first principles, no? So things that go first. And he would say a body is any substance of which we can gain a knowledge by our senses. Hence, air, water, earth, in all their modifications are called bodies. The second one, there are certain properties which are common to all bodies, but these are called essential. But then there are, and then it's named, impenetrability, extension, figure, divisibility, inertia, attraction. Then it goes into a differentiation, and you see it builds a kind of a system that tries to account for the richness of the phenomena without giving in to the universality of calling these things bodies. And the openness or the constellation of these systems now is that it says, well, the amount of the phenomena are not total. So when we have a new branch of mechanics, the bodies start to appear, to show themselves in a way that we have not been able to see them before. Yeah? So it's an accumulative, it's an evolutive, if you want, display or presentation of phenomena, which cannot reduce to a question of either the essence of being or the subjective point of view which would capture the truth. It's always a mixture of those. So when we know how to handle a certain mechanism, we understand something of a natural context, but we cannot have one authoritative explanation based on that particular mechanism. So it's a kind of an open system notion, which is here. And the implications of this is nicely discussed, for example, in this book here. This is quite a recent one. So there has been in the last, I would say, 10, 15 years, a kind of a renewed interest in natural philosophy. So this is for everybody who has some association with Descartes. It's almost like offending, no? So isn't there a more rationalist, a more formalist philosopher than Descartes? This is our reception today. And yet, that is a reading which is very narrow and which overemphasizes one particular aspect that he invented with regard to space by taking it out of the constellation of projects in which he was working. And to kind of discuss Descartes' quest, it's always with natural philosophy, what is involved is a kind of a mimesis with the ones who find something out, with the ones who are inventive, with the ones who are making scientific propositions. It's not so much taking these propositions and kind of weighting or evaluating or judging their truth or their falsity. It's about the architectonic stance of getting how this thing was thought. How could someone invent, imagine what is proposed in the writings? This is how this book is written. And what is peculiar to it is that this approach will always involve the oeuvre as a whole. No? So it will not say in this particular, for example, in the Principia of Descartes, he argues this, or in his text on analytic geometry, he argues this. It will always look at all these things in constellation. And in the case of René Descartes, of course, his interest, one of his main interests was it was the time when the new astronomical models of the world became articulated and claimed. So Kepler was a contemporary of Descartes, and you all know the story probably, no? That he was burnt by the church for heresy and so on. So it was a very serious thing. How science could proceed to be an experimental science, so to go and quest into the unknown, to bring back ideas that were not compatible with the dogmatics of the wisdom cultures or of the theological, the religious cultures. How could there be a framework which allows science the freedom to continue to be science without threatening religion so much? This was Descartes' life quest. I'm very convinced of that. And like I said, with many of these things that I'm saying, one can, of course, see them differently. But he was living through the Reformation wars, where in Europe, and this is, we always forget, 30% of the population was killed in between the dispute between the Catholics and the Protestants. And of course, the Protestants were super affirmative to the new experimental modern paradigm of science, whereas the Catholics had a more orthodox stance, tendentially to this. So this was his reality. So what he tried to do is to translate a lot of the metaphysical questions that could be challenging the doctrines into a mechanic display, into an imagination which is objective, but for which the objectivity does not claim to represent the truth. Simply a way of understanding how things are related insofar as they're handled in the manner that is proposed by the treatise. No? This is the natural philosophy approach. So you see, it's a lot about principles and how principles can become, if you want, mechanical. No? So that one principle, because a principle means a first. No? If we think strictly, if we think with respect to truth about principles, there cannot really be many principles. It's like with the origins. No? There's one. So for a mechanic, because the system is through these constellations and in an open way, there is no problem to have different principles. We still have this. No? When we have, well, actually, it was a big dispute recently. If you followed this in the media, it made it into the media with the kilogram that loses weight. I don't know if you caught attention to this, but this was what was at stake. There was that so since the Enlightenment, there's this institution of it's called the International Bureau of Weights and Measures, and it really organizes the standardization of our metrical systems, which are crucial, of course, for economy, for globalization, for technological science, for all these things. There's basically one institution, which is a global institution now, but it's situated in France, and it used to have prototypes of all the measures that were to be called international or later global. So for meter, for kilogram, of course, for all sorts of measurement units, there were physical prototypes with which one could always calibrate whether the taking measure is still adequate. So they were protecting something like the representation that our art of measuring is faithful to the truth. And this was 19th century. This was before universal algebra. This was before the abstractions that we had in the 20th century. So they actually had these prototypes, but these prototypes were gradually replaced by symbolic algebraic formulations that would allow us to just calculate and then compare with the calculation whether the measurement is still adequate. But the systematicity of it, which was supposed to be an analytical systematicity to conform to Newton, was gravity. No, gravity is the one force that unites all the physical forces. Without gravity, modern physics, classical modern physics, could not be called an analytical system. It would be a mechanic system, no? In the sense of the constellations, where you don't have the foundational power and then what is derived from it. So all of these things were symbolized except the kilogram, because the kilogram was too complicated. They always made new prototypes. They are still, I think, treasured, like some religious icons. So there are copies. They are buried underground, because the thing is that these prototypes, they waste away with time. No? So they are stuff in the end. And that's what was the formulation with these headlines, that the kilogram is losing weight. So the reference of the prototype for gravity is actually not faithful anymore. And this was a kind of a media story to go to affirm the total abstraction of the measurement system. So to also find a symbolization that includes, that articulates gravity. And with that, definitely introduces a quantum physics view that is more comprehensive than the classical, than the Newtonian view, into the taking of measures. So it was, yeah, you can Google this. There is a lot about it. It's interesting to see what about this was really upsetting people, even in the popular media. No? So I don't want to ridiculize or to make this a kind of a pun or a fun story, but I do think that a bit of comicness is the right thing to do with these questions that are so threatening, because it's also the mechanic point of view. No? One can look at it from many sides. I don't go into the argument now with Descartes. This would go too far, but that's important to know. So mechanics will entail system, it will entail principle, it will entail a certain analyticity, but not one that is overall exhaustive and consistent. That's the difference. No? So it gives away the criteria of exhaustiveness. And this is a bit then like an analytical system becomes a bit like a vernacular language. No? So the vernacular languages in Europe, they have all been codified in the Renaissance, largely. Before, writing was in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek in Europe. One didn't write in Italian. One certainly didn't write in German or in any other of the vernacular languages. This is something that came quite late. And they're called vernacular in the sense that they were encoded or encrypted with the model of how grammar of the authoritative, of the ancient languages were derived. And here again, no, the linguists often tried, until especially in the 19th century, they tried to find an original language. And you can imagine how the fighting was, whether it is Hebrew or Greek, or then, yeah, Latin or a language from any other part of the world, because they wanted to say the vernacular languages need to become writing that is faithful to the original system of thinking. And the people who codified the vernaculars, the approach was a natural philosophy one. It was a mechanical one. They wanted to find a way to encode the manner in which people would actually talk today. No? They didn't want to translate the knowledge that came with all these new measurement devices. So this is modern science. They didn't want to translate this into the registers of languages, in the case of Latin, which was not even spoken anymore in a vivid way. So they wanted to speak about their science in a non-canonic way, in a vernacular way, in a way which would demonstrate its validity through the thing itself, through the fact that was being described. And it's very much in this sense almost that the usage of principles here in the discussion of Descartes' work features. No? So I call this I have started to, because in architecture treatises are full of exactly this gesture. That's why in the treatises you always have a set of categories, like here, like we saw. No? So first bodies, and then for bodies is this, but then the relation is this. In Vitruve it's these 6 categories, it's the 3 aims of the Venustas, Utilitas, and I forgot the third one. No. So these categories, because they are categories, they're not semantics. So whoever uses them might use them differently. A bit like one uses different instruments for different purposes. So there is or my interest, what I want to foreground with the natural philosophy is a kind of a proposal that we should start to think of scientific vernaculars. No? So to have the coexistence of the different idioms that allow us to be precise in the fields where we do research. So instruments are crucial for this, but it's not only the instruments, it's always the way that the instruments are thought. No? This is just an example. So we are very much kind of concerned between optics as being this total physical, objective domain of light, and then the point of view, or the perspective, no? Or den Ansichtsraum as being subjective. But the interest of such an architectonic and such a natural philosophy approach is that, of course, the subject becomes a different one if technological devices are at its use. So it's like we are different when we grow up with the computer and the internet and all of these things, to a large degree, at least, no? And the same with all the industrialization devices. So the devices, they come to play a kind of a diplomat or a mediacy role, but not in the sense of giving us a meta level that could allow us to be critical with regard to the system as a whole, but they embody knowledge. No? They embody knowledge. And it's knowledge which partly is invented by humans, but partly works because it's physics, it's mathematics. So the one, that's I think part of this renewed interest that people take in natural philosophy, there is one distinction, nevertheless, that remains kind of guiding, and it's the distinction that there are things which depend on us and there are things which do not depend on us. No? So instead of having different kinds of being, there is this distinction with which it works. And that's what the principles are supposed to mediate. Now, yeah, this here is actually the citation. So the world picture, as it changed with the natural philosophy approach, that emphasizes on mechanics, is well captured here. So while Aristotle had divided knowledge or science into the theoretical, the practical, and the productive sciences, there were three theoretical sciences: mathematics, which deals with those things that do not change and have no independent existence; physics, or natural philosophy, which deals with those things that do change and have an independent existence; and metaphysics, or first philosophy, which deals with those things that do not change and have an independent existence. Natural philosophy was the pivot on which everything else turned here. Both the relation between natural philosophy and metaphysics and that between natural philosophy and mathematics were problematic. This is what I mean with the openness. There is no one system that makes everything fall into a proper place. It depends on how one picks it up. Now I want to kind of bring this to a more contemporary emotionality, let's say, by starting to speak of this in terms of existence. So you might all have association with existentialism as basically the major philosophical paradigm or school in the 20th century. So on a large scope, not a kind of a particular discourse territory, but in the sense of doing philosophy, it's existence, existentiality, and its core notion is, if you want, a reflection on this constellatory setup of knowledges. So you cannot, by following a rational path from one point, know that it will lead you to the next. So there is an abyss everywhere. Existentialism was emphasizing on the absurd for this. The absurd is literally what sounds from the bottom of things, whereas the bottom of things cannot be reached. It's out of reach. And I like very much to get, in a way, the profundity of this approach, because I think of it as a kind of a spiral that goes both. So the way to attend to the absurd, if you think of it as a mechanic, we will involve a spiral movement. So it can go down and it can go up. And there are two, so progress, I mean, no? Because of course there is a way of advancing, of reaching somewhere, but the direction for this can go, is vertical with existentialism, and it goes in two ways. And the two writers, Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre, they are the main representatives of existentialism, and I think well, actually, Camus is not most famous for the nuptials in nature. So this is a text that is more actually considered a kind of a biographical and a minor work. He's more known for The Stranger or for his reading of Sisyphus. But for Sartre, certainly this sentence that l'enfer, c'est les autres. So there is a sense of disgust with the world, of l'enfer, that's hell. No? This is actually not going away when we totalize the social domain for philosophy. Quite the opposite. So Sartre's pieces are all about the more we focus into the intimacy that comes with the social relations, the more we get trapped in what earlier times used to call hell. So, and what I'm saying with these things is just that, like so often, literature, arts, they capture more complex emotionality. So the concern there is not with empirical or epistemological adequate representation. It's about capturing what is going on. And this, I think, to give you two more examples that are helpful. One is in the time when Einstein formulated the general relativity, we could go to Ngram now and see how the usage of the term relativity changed. Now, it took some time after the publication, and relativity became one of the most popular words. A lot of people will say this is a problem because it makes science fuzzy, no? Because people associate whatever with relativity. My point would be, like here, quite the opposite. So new abstractions, new paradigms are being socialized by becoming idioms in which people, through their vernaculars, start to rearrange their emotionalities. And we are experiencing something similar today with, and I've learned this only recently from students, with the sigma zone. No, with the sigma zone. The sigma is a summation function in algebra. It's a very, very abstract. I think the sigma algebra is on a similar level abstract like the lambda calculus. The lambda calculus is like these mechanical systems, so there is not an order to mathematics, and yet everything can be represented in it. This is Wolfram's Mathematica environment, which represents it. So it's way too abstract to be directly useful. Okay, we don't go there. What I want to suggest is that with such a notion of existentiality with regard to scientific vernaculars, we can think the stance of somebody that would travel through existence. So travel across these abysses, the absurd, and give accounts of what one finds as a way to share the knowledges, basically. In an experience-related way, and also as a way to start to socialize and populate the notion of space in a way that is much more consistent, that is much more accommodative for the quantum physical and the digital paradigm. Now, the digital space brings the analytical space into a self-reference, so it lets it explode, basically. That's why we don't have representations. We have codified representations in the digital. So the presence of code can no longer appear to be absolutely transparent. We can, in the digital, convert energy to color, to weight, to taste. We can digitize objects. We can materialize digital types, and so on. So there is a physics of the digital which brings the representational logics of an analytical space to its limits. That's a bit the background why to think then, so how could we approach space? Now, how could we approach this? And I think the notion of existence coupled with geography, so it's a way to make graphs of the world as a whole. That's now the thing where I want to go to Fritz Haller. So the world as a whole, geography, graphs of the world as a whole, that will not be the same like an atlas which collects the maps of the territories into which the Earth's surface happens to be sociopolitically subdivided. No? So it's a notion of geography that is, again, very much coming out of the natural philosophy tradition, where a geography would also be a mapping, but it would be a mapping that bridges between a very regional kind of scope, a regional attention to a place with a cosmographic model, because the cosmographic model will allow to interlink the situational maps with other maps that are spoken in the same cosmographical coding language, if you want. So it's a way of doing maps, of characterizing and graphing environments to the level of geology, of course, or of any detail that you want, that will be capable to be translated between the different sciences or between the different political interests, of course. And for it, the one who makes these maps, these cartographies, is involved as a person. But because he's involved as a person, it's not his own thinking that matters. This is a paradoxical statement, but that's why there is the sentence, it thinks like we say it rains. This is another way to attend to this mechanical paradigm. So it thinks like we say it rains. That doesn't mean I think, and it doesn't mean the main concern is who am I when I think. It's an impersonal pronoun that can address anonymously anyone who speaks it as a person. No? It's a kind of a code relation. This is a proposal made actually by a 19th century psychologist, one of the founders of psychology. It's William James, one of the founders of pragmatism as well. And you see his approach. He asked for principles of psychology. He didn't try to give an analytical representation of how our psyche works. So it's not psychoanalysis. It's not a mechanics. Psychoanalysis is a kind of a symbolic mechanics that operates within a model of the psyche. That's not his approach. His approach is, like we saw in the table of content with Descartes or in the natural philosophers, he was to say, let us assume principles and let us study the psychic processes in order to better understand what we can generalize from them to apply to more people. And where do I have? Here, the fourth person singular is what he called it. This is from Henry James. He says, I would call the fourth person singular the unruly murmur of a force and voice of which nobody speaks, but which still exists unvoiced. You see this relation to the realism. It's a voice which is there, but even when nobody speaks it, as a voice it is there. So it's a way to attend to the supra-personal level of mathematical descriptions. No? They somehow hold, even if nobody knows them. That's why, with regard to mathematics, we don't say we invent it. Not really, or few people do. It's a mixture. It's more like we find it. But then that is also not really adequate, because we don't find it like, I don't know, a leaf hidden behind a rock, no, which appears when we lift the rock. It's abstractions, it's paradigms, it's speculations which allow us to find mathematical formulations. So it's in this same sense, he generalizes this. It says, reducible neither to individual persons nor to a sea without difference, the fourth person singular is a name for the accursed share of every I and every we, an immanent, inappropriable, and fragmentary outside that insists and persists in the interstices and frayed edges of the established terms of order and occasionally bursts in their midst, belonging neither to one who acts nor to what is acted upon. It is the grammatical person of metamorphosis itself, the mute voice of the it rains, it blows, it thinks. So there is an emphasis to the weather as this kind of voice. And with this, I want to to generalize now with the space colony project. So for the space colony project, it's important to know that Haller was mainly perhaps famous for doing research on a notion of the knot. What he wanted is an idea to generalize a knot. And this, in many ways, is almost a contradiction in terms, no? Because a knot comes with topology. And the topology precisely does not go with space in the sense of axis and coordination, but it goes with networks. So topology is with structure and with network. So it's, if you want, a kind of a compositional thing. And the knots are the links between the joints, the articulations of it. So if we would generalize them, it would mean to geometrize topology. And this seems like a frustrating thing to do, because topology was perceived as such a liberation to get out of the geometrical narrowness. No? That would be directive, where you would have the straight, the vertical dimension, and you have the right angle, and you have the equality, which seems to be so inadequate to compare things. Topology was a promise and a celebration for being adequate to the incomparable. And it is, in many ways. No? So what Haller, and this is a project from Waxman, Konrad Waxman, who was Haller's friend and his collaborator in many projects. I like it because it helps to see the abstractions. It was not about the conquest. It was not that geometry should now conquer, no? The new promise of topology. It was a natural philosophy approach. How can the two work together? And this still here is from a movie that Waxman did, which he called Experiments of Motion in Space and Time. It's called A Motion Machine. And you can look it up. It's on YouTube. It's a beautiful contemplation of a body that is moving in the outer space. And his strange promise was this moving body, if we think of it as a motion machine, it can help us to understand the dynamics between the generalization through geometry of the knots in topology with the structures. And it seems so abstract that it's so hard to imagine what was really the promise, until one kind of relates again this first principle. So a motion machine is almost like an iconic representation of the task that principles perform in natural philosophy. Because the problem is always, how does it all start? And a motion machine says, well, I start from motion being there. No? Whatever it was that brought it, whatever it is that takes it away, we start from motion being there. A motion machine is a machine which harvests motion in the generic sense, so not a certain way of moving or a particular dynamics, but motion itself, by not asking where it comes from, but by acknowledging it is there. And I want it mechanical. I want to see what mechanisms can do with motion being there. And it's a very, it's a beautiful project. And it's in such a sense, so the generalization of the knot would be something that links the joints in a structure, in a network, to a moment that is transcendent, no? Like this motion machine to the Earth. It's of the same kind, but it's somehow separated from it. So it's a model, it's a mechanics that tries to convey something and not to explain. And in the case of Haller, I mean, there is a book coming out shortly, which is also the background for my research in these things on Fritz Haller, where there is one contribution really attending to the mathematicalness in which this generalization of the knots were thought. This one is the knot that became most popular by Fritz Haller. It's a knot that basically shows in a furniture system in the USM Haller. You might know it. But the thinking that went into this knot, no, goes much further. And my approach to studying his space colony project was to say it's the same thinking of the generalization of the knot that is at work in his building system. So he also built houses. And his houses were always animated and inspired by the ambition to be so light that it can be gone tomorrow. Yeah? So he wanted to build houses that are almost not there. This is the one thing. And the second thing is he wanted to build houses that are fast. Houses needed to be fast. And that's another almost a mystical kind of thing to say. No? How can we think of this? The way I make sense of it is precisely through the role of the joints in the system, because with the joints there can be a translation between many scales. And if there are many scales which don't homogenize in a dimensionality that ultimately is the analytical 3D Cartesian space, but that have a certain autonomy of their own, we have many scales that are not necessarily commensurate, coexisting in one systematic articulation. But this was not my project to write about. Mine was this space colony. So my approach to say it's about the same thing was to say the space colony is a celebration of the knot in its splendor. No? So it's not the knot in its utility. It's a kind of a manierist minimalism. So the celebration of something in its splendor must be a minimalist articulation. We cannot celebrate the splendor of something, then we go into Üppigkeit and into so at least I didn't prepare how to make an argument for this. But in my understanding, the celebration of splendor is precisely what minimalism does. So minimalism is not a functional and a pragmatic thing. It's a celebratory thing. And minimalism is what they were all celebrating. Yeah?
Can I ask a question before you go further?
Please.
I don't know what the word splendor means. I'm so sorry.
Splendor. We are just about to distribute a call for papers for an issue on splendor, which starts with a table of, I think, 30 citations where people use splendor, and there really is not one sense. But splendor has something to do with eine Üppigkeit almost, an exuberance. A splendor is, but it has to do with a brilliance. It has to do with a kind of an aura almost, people would say. Or, well, let's see quickly what Tim Online says. That always gives a good spectrum.
Is it related to the word splendid?
Yes, of course.
Okay, then I got it.
Yeah. Where do I have? So here it says splendor, radiance, great brilliance, source of magnificence or excellence from Old French. Anglo-French esplendeur, directly from Latin, brilliance, brightness, splendere, to bright, shine, like in splendid, a great show of riches and elegance. No? So I would say if you celebrate splendor, not through minimalism, what you create is pomp. And you lose splendor. You lose the spiritual aspect of splendor when you go to pomp. It's also cool, of course, but it's something else. And this was my point. So to celebrate the knot in its splendor, so to look for a generalization of the knot through celebrating the knot in its splendor. That's the gesture. And then with this, because the generalization always means it's not subjective, no? So the I doesn't matter. And then this goes together with a kind of thinking that is climatic, like this it thinks, like it rains. So it is a thinking, but it's natural philosophy I. No? It's a kind of an anonymous or a fourth person singular way of addressing an agency that is anonymous and yet always to a certain extent personal. Just like a weather has character. No? And weathers, they come and they go, they are much alike often, but there is something unique at the same time. But the generalization of the weather, this is what manifests in what we call climate. And climate is worldwide. Weather is always local. Climate is global. The in-between, between weathers and climate, this is what in geography is called then zones. No? So then there are climatic zones. And we read them from reading the landscapes and the fertility of the landscapes in the areas. And what makes climate a geographical dimension is precisely the world model, where the climate comes from having the equator and having the ecliptic plane. So it's a kind of a notion of space, of natural philosophy space, that is analytical, but not in the purely formal way, between the rotational movement of these two planes that allow us to address the world through zones that are characteristic and yet they're natural. There is this is a much larger argument, which I can now not make here, but it relates to this notion of the bodies and the elements. And the climate, I think, is what the space, I think the next slide is now finally the space. Okay, let's go there here. So this, yeah, you saw it already, no? The space colony. It looks like this. How much time do I have? Still some time, huh? Okay. Then I don't make this too short. Where we will go is that the beauty, so this notion of the colony, I was struggling so much. How can we possibly think of this colony in a way that doesn't entail the conquest into unknown territories, no? The colonization gesture, the classical, or actually the modern colonization gesture. And the beauty is there is a way to read this project as the making of a place that will give a space that does not pre-exist the place that the project makes. So the making of a place is in the sense that we will see, or probably you know if you learn with Sandra about the liberation points. No? So these capsules in space, there are very particular points in the near Earth space where it's possible to place a station. And these are points where the gravitational forces between two large masses, for example, the Earth and the Moon, cancel each other out. They're called liberation points. In the Earth-Moon system, there are 5 of them. The project is only possible because it sits in one of those. So it literally sits in a place where gravity is being cancelled cosmically, huh? But as if mechanically, because that's what mechanisms do. No, they learn to cancel forces. That's why you have a positive and a negative pole. So it sits there, but that's not enough. What it then does, it climatizes itself. It creates a climate through a parabolic mirror, which takes in the sunlight. No? So it infuses itself. I don't know how to say this right. No, it takes the energy from the sun into this place, which is in the cancelled gravity. It creates a climate, and this is only possible because it creates an artificial gravity through rotating around itself. So through a locomotion, in a certain extent. And then what to do? What for? And this was, of course, the point that I was most interested in. Because all these things, and Halle doesn't claim, of course, no, that he kind of came up with this. So he made this together with an MIT study who was existing already since, I think, 10 years before he started to work. He collaborated with them. So there is no claim to inventiveness to these things. But what I, in his project, for the first time was able to see is, in a way, this metaphysical symbolism. No? And how it is not just taken for granted and then exhausted or harvested, but how it is addressed architectonically, because this place, what it was supposed to be, is a place to study some of the changes that happen on Earth. It is not a place that was imagined as a utopian colony where life on Earth, when the Earth gets inhostile, can find new territory and new realms. It was not a utopia like this at all. It was, I have some citations from Halder about this. It was literally a place that would be of the same kind like this new physics that was changing the life on Earth in the 20th century, which is quantum physics. And a lot of the quantum physics paradigms are actually paradigms of physics that at that time still they were calling the outer space physics. And Haller has a long passage where he describes how it appears to be paradoxical in this and this way, and so on. But we will get to that. So his idea, and that's the architectonics I mean, was we need to create a place that is of the same kind of physics like the one which is alien now on Earth and to which we cannot find a distance because we are immersed in it, in order to study, observe, and learn to domesticate the developments that are underway. So it's an observatory. It's a kind of an observatory that he was thinking. And it's in this sense that this notion of the colony does not mean there is a mother city first and then people are sent away. They expand the domain of reign. It's not like that. It's like in an approach. So this is now from the other side where I'm actually have done a lot more work than on this. For me, this is fairly new. It's with regard to language. No? So the paradigm in language which can affirm code. So say code plays a role everywhere. And yes, code makes it complicated to distinguish different notations. It makes it complicated to say that language is something really different from metrical systems of notation or from mathematical symbolisms. So there is something with regard to code that makes everything blurry. And there, the approach that I settled temporarily with more and more was to say, okay, if we give primacy, if we don't think that the code is secondary, so we understand something, then we codify it, but that like a mechanic, we begin to speculatively codify things until it clicks, no? And it does something that can be repeated. We don't know what it is, but it clicks. So we codify what we don't know. Not we codify what we know in order to keep it safe, but we codify in a splendid way, in a way insanely, because we don't know, into the open that we don't know. So it's a codification where the code precedes. So it's I would think of, so, well, not just I, this is a way how translation is used in mechanics. Translation in mechanics is the literal transport of certain relations into another constellation. It doesn't mean it explains these relations, but it's called a translation. And the translation comes from rotational movements. It's like when we have the gears on the bike, no? We translate. So the gears that shift, this is a kind of a translation. It's a translation which manifests in terms of weight, of gravity, of physics, of accelerations, and so on. But it's translation. And with code, before it comes to think or to be a translation from an original language to a derivative one, or from a more sophisticated one to a more primitive one, or whatever, the coding means to work mechanically like this. So we codify things we don't understand until it clicks. No? And then when it clicks, we hold on to it. We start to represent it. We start to compare it. We start to saturate it, to endow it with things. So it's coding like that. And in the same way now, I want to think of the space colony as a space that is established through clicking coding. Before what we would, in the analytical reading, call the mother space, or the original space, so not the colony, but the reference, would be there, no? And then to say such a notion of the colony that comes out of literally the physical nothing. Yes, please.
I don't really understand how language and code differ then, because in the beginning you said rhetorics relates to mechanics, and to me, if I would see language in a mechanical way, I could say that that's code.
Yeah, I agree. But then we lose so many distinctions, no? So there's a lot of, mechanical wisdom, we could say, perhaps, in how languages form. So what grammars are. So that we kind of establish an intersubjective way of referencing with the cases, for example, no? Situations, relations to the situation. So they all manifest in what has come out as a grammatical syntaxis. And they are distinctions which, if we think of them mechanical, are beautiful because they're manifold, and it's a good thing they're manifold. It's a good thing that there are languages which have 25 cases. We have 4. No? So, but we don't speak the same language. That means we don't have the same relations to the world and to things, like the people who are native in languages with 25 cases. So there's a lot of commonness, for sure, but it's not the same way. And we have the same with tenses, of course. There are languages which have tenses that don't go like in the Romanic and in our language, no? From a moment in the past, which is the perfect, to how it can be brought into the future. So there are tenses, and it's mainly the Semitic languages, and I believe also some of the, I don't know how they're properly called, Chinese languages, where the tenses are much more organized like when we throw pebbles into a water pond, and then there is a center, this is the present, and what is further away is further away from the rings. But it's coexistence. Time is synchronous, but spectral somehow. And then you can imagine how the notion of space, of course, is also different if the tenses are like that. And I haven't studied this as a linguist would, you know, so there would be much more precise ways now to exemplify what I mean. But there is one book that I can highly recommend if you're interested in these things with language and code and this kind of, he doesn't call it mechanics, but he speaks of a comparatistics. This is the book After Babel by Georg Steiner. Georg Steiner, I think he was Swiss, but he established basically in linguistics what is called comparatistics. And comparatistics is not the same like comparative studies. No? Comparative studies, we have it in many places, but comparative studies means we need one model with respect to which we compare the others that we describe. Comparatistics says, no, we don't have this one model with respect to which we could compare the others. We need to study all these different things in order to forge something that can help us to translate between the languages. So it doesn't exist, like the mother city doesn't pre-exist the colony here, or like the source text that would be codified doesn't pre-exist this tuning clicking of the mechanic who codifies. It's in a similar way, this is comparatistics, but he doesn't speak in a technical, he doesn't even try to make also these relations to mathematics. It's a very beautiful book, Georg Steiner. But it's so complicated to think, no? How can code precede the analytical systematization of the way how the codes interlink? How can we think this? And that's, I think, why I care so much for reconnecting prior to the Enlightenment separation of art and science, or art and, so the fine arts academies and then the mechanical art academies. Because if we fuse the two, if we say that, of course, art involves techniques, because without the techniques we cannot do these speculative codings. And we cannot even hear when it clicks. No? We don't know when it tunes, because the tuning cannot come because somebody says, oh, I like this. No? So it must click objectively, like with a mechanism. We cannot will them to work. Sometimes we find one, but we cannot will them. It's not a totally arbitrary thing. And yet it involves inventiveness. So this would not be possible without having the equally speculative systematization of things. Fair enough? So, the space colony. Maybe an intermediate point which is important to help this celebration of the not in its splendor. So this is from a sketchbook by Haller, where you can see his analytical space. No? So the point was that he took the axis of the analytical space and he polarized them. So he thought, or he projected something like electromagnetism onto it. So the different planes of the analytical space is polarized. And the next step then was to say, this polarized space now needs to be modularized. The notion of modularity that begins to, and the module is a very interesting notion. Actually, the best person to read about the module, I know many people will hate me now, but it's Le Corbusier. Huh? It's actually Le Corbusier. One doesn't need to go as far as to share or try to hope to see in the modular as a kind of an iconic representation of a source to gain it from, but the understanding of the module in the old sense, where a module is a kind of a base, it's a kind of like with the columns, it's a base that is of a certain proportionality, out of which the proportions for the whole building need to be taken for the possibility of the building to be well proportioned. This is one of the self-referential coding paradigms that in architecture has been there from the early formulations. So, and the module notion then in algebra becomes crucial, where it relates to, well, it has to do with the difference between a field and a structure and then more abstract constructions. I'm also not literate enough to expand on this, but if you're mathematically minded, you can figure it out. And the module, so what he did is not to go for one module. So the generalization of the knot or the finding of the minimalism gesture, it comes from polarizing the analytical space and then discretizing it in a way that is not purely formal but physical. So these modules, they would work physically. So it's what I would want to say is that it's treating the analytic space and the formality of the analytic space in an approach that I would call it's close to the interest that many people have today through new material, so-called new materialism, through Stofflichkeit. It's not quite matter, it's not quite mass, it's not more specific than that, but it involves I find it the most apt word for it in German, Stofflichkeit. The English, I don't know an equivalent. No, Stofflichkeit, it's bodies. It's something like discrete. So, yeah, it's a notion of body that does not suggest a kind of a notion of an organism or an organicness that would be in contradiction to a mechanics. This is what I care about. So it's a kind of the Stofflichkeit of the analytical space that not only him, also the motion machine was thought like that. So, and then now we come to the screen. No? So we all know from Alberti the veil. So the beginning of this kind of analytical perspective, where in between what we take into sight and the representation we create, there is a kind of a grid. No, it's a transparent screen. So this would, so here I place the code always, no, with these veils. So it's a kind of a grid, a rationalized grid. In Renaissance, this was between the site, die Szene, die man in den Blick genommen hat, no? The sight which was taken into sight, and the translation or the transcription into a rational perspective, a drawing of it. And now imagine that all the codes, so if you have an analytical space that is elemental, that is stofflich, like here, so polarized, and then discretized and modularized, you have screens everywhere on all the vertices, or wherever, or on all the measures that you draw from these modules in order to construct something with. You have such veils, many of them, forming a kind of in optics, this is called a caustic phenomena. So caustics is when you have so you have a transparent medium. So to make it simple, when you study how the sun casts patterns in a riverbed, No? And then you have the water, which is transparent, but you have the waves, you have the currents, and the pattern that shows on the bottom is a beautiful pattern, but it's hard to see a regularity in it. This is what in physics is called caustics. So in caustics, you study the depth of different transparencies. And it's something like this. So with the digital now, we have a kind of a caustic depth of such veils. No? So when we speak of an aspect space, ein Ansichtsraum, with a subject that is like the weather, no? It thinks. It's not me. I don't totalize myself. There's a personal point of view, but it's an anonymous address. So this is what we can think through caustics. And there is one particular figure that I find very helpful to imagine this. And it's what our friend Elias Zafiri, who teaches also at our department, what he calls the architectonic act. It sounds bombastic, but in a way it is bombastic. So he says, imagine you want to look at the whole world. There are two inverse ways in which you can do this. One, you try to go to where it's really dark, on the top of a mountain, and watch the night sky. What you need to do when you do this is you look for a relation of immediacy to the whole world. No? You try to do away with everything that could interfere, to the consequence that everything that you will see centers around you. You cannot study the night sky without making yourself the center of what you will see. So this is when you want to look at the whole world with the aim of an immediacy. The inverse is you accept that structures like temples or churches or architecture at large are a kind of a miniature of a cosmic order. So there is a kind of an analogy relation between representational spaces that are engendered from how the world at large has been thought, the cosmos. No? So this was the paradigm for architecture from Vitruv until Bauhaus, inclusive Bauhaus. So architecture is a kind of a splendid reduction, no? A reduction, celebration through reduction of the splendidness of the cosmos. So if you affirm this, then you cannot make yourself the center. It's more like you imagine that you learn to study this order of the cosmos while placing yourself in a structure that is articulated, in a temple, for example. And it doesn't matter really which one, because it's clear that there are many different paradigms. So that's another question. But you will always study it in relations of mediacy. And what you cannot do when you try to study the world through an order that exists is put yourself at the center. Because it's the cosmos, or it's a god, in case of a temple. So the center is always occupied by what is not you. If you study it in terms of, if you try to study the whole world by extrapolation through structures of mediacy, so not immediacy. So with immediacy, you look at the night sky and all circles around you. If you go for mediacy or representation or politicalness, you cannot make yourself the center. The center needs to be free for something else, for a principle, no? And it's not that one is good and the other is bad. That's what I try to say, but they are inverse to one another. They are inverse to one another. And what we can do now with such things, with this veil, no? Or with this kind of caustic thinking, is to stand, if you want, speculatively, because we can imagine ourselves, we can take our own stances into sight. This is what we call ethics. No? We don't act immediately how we feel. We act as persons in different contexts differently. We can do this, and then we can be with one leg in the representational order, in the immediate one, and with one leg in the night sky. And this is what I would call this screen, no? So to say imagination in this in this objective way. This is an imagination which is a screen where on the one hand we have the sunlight and on the other hand we have the moon side. So all the representational structure, so every mediate structure, this comes from the moon side. No? So the moon side means that's because the moon doesn't have an original brilliance. It receives the light of the sun and it tempers the colors. No? It makes matter, basically, mass and matter. So it's a massive phenomenon, the moon. And caustics is with the moon side. Caustics is a kind of an optics that is only immediately in relation to the sunlight. It's not the optics of the white light where you have the sum, not the white light as the sum of all the colors, regardless of any color scheme. And the sunlight, on the other hand, this is like in the project here. The sunlight is not just the white light. The sunlight is also the source of energy. The sunlight is also what we can create climatic circumstances with. This is how we can temper things such they can tune. So the imagination in this objective sense is a screen that on the one hand projects for the display moon-side vision, when we envision something, but in such a way that it remains accommodative and reflective to the sunlight. So to the tempering of basically in terms of quantum physics, the moon side goes with the mass and the sunlight goes with the photons. So light, in terms of everything in quantum physics, is optics in the sense that it's always about light. And light has this double character of coming as mass and as photon. And photon, nobody has ever seen it because it's outside of time. Photon is literally a symbolic definition of particles that have no mass. So a photon is like this place where the gravity of the two bodies cancel each other out. It exists, obviously, because we do things with it mechanically, like sending telephone calls around the globe with optical fiber cables, so that we speak in real time. Imagine, it's literally what happens when we call. Last week, my partner was in China. We speak as if it's just next door. My voice is translated into light. It goes around the globe. It's translated out of light into sound. And we talk as if there is no delay between. This is the photons. This is quantum physics that employs the photons. And it's this kind of, this sounds miraculous, but it's not. It's just that we don't think of it. And Haller, when he said about his project, so that we can have some time to talk as well. This is from the introduction, his introduction to the book. Here the citation, not the stuff next to. He says, the ancient dream of humanity of reaching into the cosmos has become a reality in this century, and the utilization of this new realm has already begun. We make telephone calls, we watch television using devices that can transport signals via geostationary satellites from any location to any other location on the Earth's surface. Utilization of the peculiar characteristics of outer space physics has been initiated or is being prepared. The changes of our life possibilities resulting from these new technologies are still largely unknown and hidden in the dark. And then the way that he formulated his ambition, where do I have it? Is this. He continues to say, what is presented here with this project, Space Colony, is an attempt by way of a real project for human settlement in near-Earth space to experience some of these changes. So this is an observatory to study this objective imagination as a screen, which displays the life changes that happen through electronic media, we could say. So and this is very remarkable. So this is exactly inverse to people that found it, Marshall McLuhan and so on. It's say, everything becomes palpable. It's all about touch. We need to immerse. Immersion is the most thing. Distance is gone. No, it was a kind of an elitist and a paternalistic thing to say that we should have distance to how we think. It's all about feeling each other in a co-synchronicity that is immediate in the real time that the media channels establish. I'm making it very drastic now, but if you read the celebrations, so this is what I meant. No, it's not celebrations of splendor through minimalism, it's celebrations of splendor through pomp. And of course, it's fantastic. I love McLuhan a lot. I studied media theory because of the fascination for this. But now I get much more fascinated with the minimalism gesture, more and more. And Haller, here's this an autodidact as well. He never studied it, but he became a professor in Karlsruhe. With a moderateness and a largeness of scope that is very, very hardly met today. No? So these things kind of calibrate always in a kind of an economical exchange. It was not like that here, but this doesn't matter that much. So the point is a bit, it's not about playing the moon against the sun, no? Playing a source of an original brilliance or a true or a kind of a revealed knowledge against the represented one, the one that we rationalize, the one that we can kind of have active relations to through ultimately codings or mechanics. It's about having one leg with respect to each, perhaps. No? So the brilliance that kind of is not ours, but we can tap into, like we tap into the sunlight with every food that we eat, with every metabolism that we do. All the plants do this too. Everything that exists does this. And at the same time, there is a kind of an agency. No? So then I would say with the sun, this is action, where the motion machine says, I don't care about how to call it by its right name. It's just there. This is action. And then there is agency. And the agency involves the reflections. It involves the formalizations. It involves the mechanisms. And of course, it is with us as well. But not only with us. It's not a human-centric in the superior, so in the sense of the human-centrism as being superior to something else. It's more a question of the proportioning, no, for human lives. So this, and then how does one stand in this? How could one stand with one leg each? Huh? So this is the contrapposto, of course, where the balance is precarious. So a contrapposto means the balance needs to be actively achieved. Statics is not what is there to start with, it's what results after knowing how to tune. This is the notion of the stance, and it involves an understanding of a chiasm. So a chiasm is, this is from Lars Buibroek. He's writing very nice texts on this, actually. And the one I like best is this one, is here the last one. So things are necessary. So chiasm is the crossing, no? So two things which would be in parallel or in analogy, they get crossed. And then you have, in the crossing point, you have a distinction between inside, outside. So you have an inversion, eine Stülpung, den Moment eine Stülpung. It's not just a revolution or a contradiction. It's an embodiment of both of these counteracting forces into a stance. The relation between the chiasm and the contrapost. And then he says to think the chiasm, this is as if one hand touches the other hand, gift and reception in a closed loop, self-crossing, not just crossing. But this self then, this is not a me as an individual. No, this is the it that thinks, like we say, it reigns. So it's a kind of a cosmic self or something like this. And the idea is that, so the window, the Alberti thing, the whale, no, which had the rational grid, this was called the window. So then, if you have the screen of imagination, the window, and this is how we can do this existentialist geography travels. No, we need to take a lot of codes. We need to create a thick transparency medium for our caustic moon sites. So basically, it's not that we need to go travel the world. We need to embrace complexity with the ordinary problems in order to study complexity of world problems in very ordinary, local, unambitious, modest things that are not necessary to resolve and to be treated in that way. But if we contemplate them, we inform or we train this stance of the objective imagination. So what becomes graspable from this it that thinks like the weather does and that manifests in a, I guess, ultimately mathematical writing. Whether this is, so this does not play mathematics against literature. No? So the point, and there are beautiful books on that, how actually mathematicians are very literary. Very literary. because it's a thinking. It's not just, we treat it as if it's just kind of a combinatorial exchange of symbols. But if you ever speak to a mathematician, he knows exactly. So when he speaks of a logarithm, it's so much more than what I could possibly imagine, because I'm not trained like this. It's like when somebody talks to you of a floor plan, it's so much more than when you talk to somebody else about the floor plan. Of course, it's the same thing with these abstractions. And the beauty with philosophy is that to a large extent, and also architectonic treatises, architecture theory, it welcomes these abstractions and builds vernaculars, no? Of how to find useful formulations for a domain of practice that ultimately, of course, changes a lot, but also in a way doesn't. Because building houses is a mimetic. What else should it be? There is, of course, there was the thesis of the original hut, but it's a colonial gesture, no? In its essence. So to claim that there would be a neutral scope for human living adequacy or something like that. It's quite cultural hostile. So a kind of to look through the window, wherever we are, into the depths of time and places, and basically do what we have always done, no? Just with a bit more of splendid minimalism. So unnecessary thoughts that we include. And this, I think, with this I want to end, is how I like to think of this place by Haller, of the not this one, well, this one in a way as well, but mainly this one. Let's see if there's something important I didn't touch now. Perhaps what is interesting, he published this book in a book titled Bauen und Forschen. No. And that's, I think, very significant. So it's an understanding of doing research through Bauen, where the research would not kind of be in a functional loop to optimize das Bauen, or where das Bauen would be instrumental to be able to do some applied research. It's really kind of a transcendental contemplational relation that he manifests here between research and a Bauen. No? So it needs to be a real project. He's not interested in a utopian speculation or in a symbolic project. It's very important that it's all real. So it's all in agreement with, as far as we know, with physics. And yet it's one of the most speculative projects, actually, that I've ever encountered. And this is so it's literally, this is, because there's a relation to mimesis that comes with natural philosophy, where mimesis is objective. No? We learn through mimesis, but mimesis doesn't mean I want to become the other. Because the mimesis is a way of coding, and then when it clicks, holding on to it, no? Contemplating it. So representing it, writing of it. And this involves a kind of a mirror relation, mimesis, which very literally is physical as well. So like the mirror in the parabolic mirror, which gathers the energy, it creates the climate. So very literally, life in the space colony is about cultivating lands of mirrored lights, shadows and reflections that chiastically cross subjective gazes and objective happenings. The site of the capsule is sustained by a huge parabolic mirror that acts as an antenna collecting sunlight and focusing it to enter the capsule of the spaceship through an artificial eye called window that is equipped with a diversion lens. On the other pole, the capsule has a climate control center, as well an airlock equipped with a reflector. In between the two polar caps, and hence literally out of a mirroring domain, the capsule expands into an artificial habitat that seeks to optimally proportion agriculture with leisure, spaces for promenades with areas of work. This is a most literal description of what the project aspires to do and how it does it with the mechanics that I could find. And with this now I want to stop. So there is a mechanics to this project. So the colony is the aggregation of a space that did not exist prior because it's engendered by this mechanics. The mechanics involves, if you want, three axes that don't form an analytical system, but a modular one and a physical one. It's a where in the liberation points, it's a how through parabolic mirrors, and it's a what, it's an artificial gravity that is being created. So these would be the principles of this mechanics. And a further step, but I will not try to talk about this now, but that is super promising then, to say this understanding of a knot is actually how we should think about the Markov chain, because the Markov chain is not like a chain, no, where you have analytical glider which you could dissect. The Markov chain has a lot to do with this relation of coding and of speculating and but I will not go there. But the celebration of the knot in its splendor, I think this is a gesture, if we can extract it in its thinking, with which we should and could attend now to AI. So Markov chains are the algorithm which is behind all of the AIs, even Google, even the organization of knowledge there. But what I find important is there's a mechanics. It's beautiful to attend through mechanics to these things. Good, thank you. These are the liberation points. They're also called Lagrange points in the Earth-Moon system. And this is a beautiful, actually, it's one of the oldest books, perhaps, about the virtual, and it's still one of the most recommendable. It's parables of the virtual, but in so many ways, his understanding of the parable is very similar to this mirrored land play that we have in the space colony. It's a notion of the virtual which has nothing to do with multiverse or a kind of purely fictional spaces. It's very bodily, it's very much playing through affects, it's very much kind of tuned through a sense of harmonics, which comes in mathematically. And it's beautiful described. It's by Brian Masumi and now here in, I don't know, the how manyth edition. It's quite a classic.
You talked about the part that this space is in between Earth and the Moon that are like canceling their gravities, and we know that there are 5 of them. And there is a nice map of it previously. Since we know that they exist, and since we know that we can create these space colonies, like how he introduced, how come they are not being part of the colonialism? Because it's finite. It's 5.
Yeah. I know not enough about how populated they are.
The thing is with these points, they exist in theory and they exist in reality, but it's hard to get there because you get there with some velocity.
Yeah.
Yes, but
it's not that. So as soon as you get there with a certain speed, it's not equal anymore. It's very hard to stay there.
so like once I enter there, it's not there anymore.
It's hard to stay in the place. I think L1, L2, and L3 are not stable. Only L4 and L5 where Hallas station is. But it's hard to get there because when you go there, you have a certain energy that has no counter.
But your question is, in principle, I think, independent of this, so that the fact that it's feasibly not really accessible, because if one would go there and make, I don't know, a Switzerland space colony, of course, you're totally there. No? So it was part of the imagination in which he believed that it would not be. It's not for finding new territory to expand an order which we already understand. It's a more transcendental place in the way that he was thinking of it, quite simply. This doesn't liberate it. So there are 1,000 ways in which this could, of course, unfold into a political colonialism, yes. But what I find important and what I find respectful is that there is a way to think space, even in such an evident kind of impossibility that is not driven by socio-political motifs like that, but that is driven by a kind of an, I believe in science, I guess, and in the pacifying, aspect of knowledge in the scientific sense, where it's a realism. So that's important. No? It foregrounds the realism of this site, which does not depend upon whoever puts the flag first and whoever wants it to be what it is. It is possible because it's possible. And then what we do with it, that's another story. This I found important. Yeah. And I find it charming because the colony, of course, it has, of course, its relation to the mother city, but the other way is in the syntactical marks, so the Satzzeichen, actually, where the colon is the comma. And this is doubly beautiful because the comma in harmonics, it's this thing which makes the two legs of the lambda never be at rest. No? So the comma is an rest which doesn't add up. So you repeat it in circle, the different chords, but it will create a difference from the cycles of iteration. It was in metaphysics, it was a very important figure in number theory as well. And it means, so the comma translates into the colon, which is a pause. And that's another thing. How can we think? So if we now have a relation to all these vacuums, the voids, or all the things that were troubling the existentialists. So what if we could think a pause as a place? So we would have to think differently of time, with that. Yeah?
What I thought is interesting now that you asked is that he writes that this space or whatever this place is to experience something of these changes.
Yeah.
But when you look at his design, he is eliminating it. He is creating artificial gravity and reproducing an image of society on Earth. This is interesting also because he writes different. He writes that this is a place that is where there is artificial gravity, but then he eliminates it.
Yeah, but that's a complicated figure because why would it, in order to study it, why would it have to be through design of the space shuttle that we could study it? Because the logics that I was trying to foreground is more that he establishes a kind of an outer place where we can stand next to ourselves, but of course we need to be artificially comfortable as ourselves to start to attend to these changes as something which we cannot yet name, we cannot yet address. No? So this is, I think, a kind of a study which was, it's not like when you try to solve a problem. This is more like you open up, it's an architectonic act, so you open up a third place, next to this you and the night sky and you and the representational order. And and this third space needs to imitate the representational order and the night sky, and that's exactly what it does, except that you watch the Earth, of course. But it represents everything that is customary now, but it does it as no, temples were not temples from the beginning, I'm sure, in the way that we think of it now. So I would like to think of this as a gesture much grander, I guess, than kind of a designable alternative living environment. Because the thing is, with the developments that we experience on Earth, we can't find a distance to it for now. No? So we pretend, we have almost real-time logistical interconnectedness of all things, and we pretend it's the counting of the days that matters, and so on. So there's a huge discrepancy between the abstractions with which we relate to our life world in everything that has changed, and the purely physical, objective things that have changed. So we are blind and immersed in that. So the grandeur I mean is to kind of bracket things and create a place for a pause. Yeah, I guess. But you're of course right. One can see it exactly as you do.
It would be interesting because if he was feeling that if he was trying to do it with the sword and with his writings, but as soon as he was drawing it, he had these images from other projects in his mind, and he could not be free enough. I don't know. This would be interesting.
Yeah.
Because it's.
But
it's the opposite.
I would expect then that this, what you call free enough, would be much more with the creativity and not with this objective imagination. No, because the objective imagination is also that things need to inscribe with time. So the weather, you cannot study it now in the next 2 hours. You need a long breath to learn something about the weather. So then if this thinking is this objective imagination is a force, it's a climatic force like the weather, one needs, so how can, it's a different thing. It's not about creativity.
Also because he used the word colony, which has a very strong meaning.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to make an impossible case for. Can there be other ways to relate to the notion of colony? Yeah. Yeah, but you're right in all the points. There is no necessity to see it how I wanted to suggest, yeah.
I love your lectures because we don't have lectures in philosophy or history on that level, I think, during the studies. And it's very important to connect physics, sociology, history. I don't know, I love your talks. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have another question, if there is none, because it was the book, another book I was referring to, when the problem that Descartes had, he didn't want to die, right?
Who?
Descartes.
Why?
No, the Descartes, when the people in that era,
Yeah.
when they were doing science,
Yeah.
and they kind of experienced that.
You mean he was afraid of getting killed?
You know, that the planets are moving, for example.
Yeah.
Because in this world, in this image of the world, there was no moving, right?
Yeah.
It was the world and the water, and the planets were fixed.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure if this was in what time or context that was. Can you explain what image of the world was valid when Descartes, did it change because of this writings, what Descartes wrote, when he wrote Le Monde Alone, for example, was there a change in this view of the world?
Yes. So, yes, so Descartes, like I said, he was contemporary to the ones who actually are more prominent for these changes. But the thing or the theological problem was that the church felt very threatened by saying that the earth is not the center of the universe, no? Because the story of the Catholic Church was that the earth is made for humankind to represent God in an order, so in a simple way. I don't know enough about this, the complexities, and I certainly don't want to ridiculize them. But it was about saying that the earth is actually circling around. It's not the center, and. These processes, they were, so I think, so first of all, I don't think any of them were afraid for themselves to die, no? So this is, if you think and write like this in an age where you literally have nobody to talk to, except writing letters, and then 3 months later you might receive an answer. Well, you have already written 3-5 more letters because you need to speak about what you do. Nobody can think on their own. And these people keep thinking of these things. They are not afraid to get uncomfortable. They are uncomfortable. So they are not afraid of risking their lives. They know what is at stake for the world, so for the kind of peace that is kept, no? The precarious peace that is kept. So Descartes didn't want to be a revolutionary. He was a scientist, but he did not want to be a revolutionary. That was his tension, I think. One can see this differently. A lot of people have, but nothing makes sense of Descartes' work otherwise. And then the text, I mean, that's part of what this book kind of nicely addresses. So it shows an image or an understanding of Descartes, where Descartes would, in iterations, always try to speak about the whole world in different projects. So the early one was the world and Traité de l'Homme. And then he realized, it's not in this way that we can start to think, to talk about the new insights and the synthesis of these new things. It will not be received in a way that will be for the better at the moment. No? So that's why he didn't publish them. And then he started to do, and it was literally 3 decades where he had writings, and there are 3 different paradigms. The last one was explicitly with the Principia, so with the principles, in the plural. Which many people then will say it's contradicting what he had said in Le Monde, and perhaps it is. You know? So why would one's understanding not change in 30 years? But I don't think this is, the historians always make this kind of artificial classifications, like when they say the early Wittgenstein and the late Wittgenstein, as if the two had nothing to do with each other. It's always the same person. And I get very angry when people try to control and dominate the thinking like that. So even if it appears to be inverse to what was kind of inspiring the early works, it's the same person who thinks. So it's all there, always. That's what I love about this natural philosophy approach. No? So trying to understand what moves this thinking, not do I agree or was he right, or not the debate positions. We have so much of those. And then it's unlikely hypothesis. So in the Renaissance and in scholasticism, there was a kind of an ethical maxim. I had this slide about the textbook tradition. And this ethical maxim was always go for the complicated relation. Huh? So there was then with the empirical turn, Occam's razor, to go with the practical and with as little assumptions as possible, but this meant divide and conquer. No? This is the beginning of the covering of the earth in a conquesting gesture. The scholastics were with the canons. They tried to preserve as much as they can. So their maxim was always, if there are 3 explanations, all of them are kind of giving an approach to the thing that you need to understand. Never go with the evident and the simple one. Contemplate the abstract ones. This was a way to train mathematical thinking, to keep the distinctions between the abstractions, and to have a feeling for what we say when we do science, no? when we are abstract. And I just do it like that. No one doesn't need to, but I approach Haller a bit like that. I don't think this was a very pragmatic thing. It was a realist thing, yes, but that does not include the splendor celebration aspect. Yeah.